This is the first video in a series about hog trapping. In this video we'll take a look at the JP Foot Snare made by John Prey of Maine. This is a radical, innovative snare thrower based on a 220 body grip. Let's take a look. This is a foot snare trap, and I'm going to be using this to trap wild hogs this year. Now I received this trap from John Prey up in Maine. He's a trapper in Maine. And he made this trap. This is his design, and he was kind enough to send me one to evaluate. And what you can tell right off the bat is this is a very highly modified 220 body grip trap. What this is designed to do is to throw a snare and get it up good and high on an animal's leg. The first thing you'll notice is that the traditional trigger has been replaced by a large pan. And this pan is held onto the jaw by a U-bolt right here, and that's also how you can vary the pan tension, is by tightening or loosening these bolts. And you can see there is the notch right there. Now as far as the snare goes, you can see there are some washers that have been bent and welded onto the corners of the trap. The snare is going to lay in these washers. The idea being, when the trap fires, the jaws are going to spring up, and that's going to throw the snare up high on the animal's leg. The trap itself, the 220 itself, doesn't clamp on the animal's leg. If you'll notice, there are a couple of links of chain that have been permanently attached to the spring eyes. This is what keeps the springs from popping completely apart. In other words, it's only going to let them go so far, and that's what keeps the 220 from clamping on the animal's leg. And you don't want the 220 on the animal's leg because you don't want him fighting the trap, you want him fighting the snare. So the trap is designed, once the trap is sprung, it's designed to fall away and the animal's caught in the snare itself. Well, this is the snare cable. The first thing you'll notice is that it is completely encased in a compression spring. This is a 7x7 cable, and you can see it's got a very secure loop on here, because if you're going to hold a wild hog, you're going to need a heavy-duty cable. You can see it's got a double ferrule there, and then it's got a stop on the end of that. So in order for this loop to come undone, both of these are going to have to fail, and that's not going to happen. It uses a standard cam lock as the locking mechanism, and the compression spring, as I'll show you shortly when we get to setting the trap, this is what helps tighten the snare loop on the animal's leg once the trap fires. The function of the trap is to get the snare up high on the animal's leg. The function of the compression spring is to actually cinch the snare cable tight on the animal's leg and ensure that you get a good solid catch. One quick word about the placement of the compression spring on the snare. It's critical to get a good smooth closing that you have the compression spring like this, just as shown. This is the correct orientation. This is incorrect. If you'll notice the difference, you do not want the compression spring touching this piece. You want it pushing right there, like that. That's going to ensure that you get a very fast, very smooth close, and that the cam is not going to impede the closing of the snare loop. Now, in order to set the trap, the first thing we have to do is we have to open the snare loop up. The problem is we have a spring pushing against it, trying to close it. So what we have to do is we have to use a locking pair of pliers. I'm using a pair of vice grips. And what I'm going to do is, you can see I've got this to where the spring can't come up through the jaws of the vise, and I'm simply going to pull the cable through until I get plenty of cable pulled up, and I'm done. You can see that is going to hold that spring back and it's going to give me plenty of cable so that I can open the snare loop up and put it on the trap. Okay, let's go ahead and set the trap. This works just like any other body grip trap. You're basically going to squeeze the jaws together, and then all we do is engage the notch on the pan and make sure your safeties are on, just like you would any other body grip. And then the last step is to thread the snare around through the bent washers. There we go. Now at this point we can remove the vice grips. We can release the tension on the spring because we've got everything where we want it. So let's take that off. And once again, make sure that you have your spring pushing against the correct spot on the lock. You do not want it pushing on that. You want it pushing directly on the top part. That's going to give you a nice smooth closing. So at this point the trap is set. All we have to do is we would bed it in the ground. We would make sure we have a depression underneath the pan to make sure there's nothing involved that's going to interfere with the pan. When the animal steps on it, the trap is going to fire, and when it does, the 220 is going to throw this snare up good and high on the leg, and the compression spring here is going to close the loop around the animal's leg. Alright, let's take a look and see if it works. Oh yeah. And the first thing you'll notice is that since these springs don't pop completely apart, I'm able to pull this 2x2 completely out of the jaws. At that point, the trap is a completely independent unit. It's out of the picture. At this point, the animal is caught by his paw or his leg by the snare. The next thing to notice is how far that trap threw that snare in vertical height. Let's take a look and see. Let's see if you can see that. $11 That is an incredibly high vertical throw for a snare thrower. That is a lot more than you're ever going to get out of a, say, a Belial foot snare. And when you get a throw this high, even if the animal senses that they've stepped on a trap or that something's firing, even if they start to pull their paw, there's no way they're going to beat that. Absolutely no way. And you can see the compression spring functioned perfectly, and I've got a good tight catch right there. Very, very nicely done. So overall, my first impression of this trap is very, very favorable. The first thing that comes to my mind after reviewing it is ingenious. Using a 220 as a foot snare thrower, I think is really ingenious. It's not only a good idea, it actually works very, very well. The second thing that struck me was the quality of materials and workmanship. You can tell that John knows what he's doing when it comes to fabrication and manufacturing. The grinds, the welds, the fit and finish, everything was perfect. I didn't have to fight or fool or tussle with anything. Everything set perfectly the first time. So I'm really excited about this, and I'm looking forward to getting the trap in the ground. I've got a batch of sour corn going, so it'll be about another 10 days or so before it's ready. And about that time, I'll update you when we get it in the ground and hopefully show you some catches. Thanks for watching.